He spoke at a forum in September 2007 on the sanctity of life with a focus on bioethics. That was the 5th forum in the Roundtable series. This is number 20, and he's seen fit to come back once again, and therefore we thank him very much for that. Welcome, Dr. Peter Slezak.
Thanks. I've just got to get my technology quite working. If you wait 1 second, I'll be with you. How do I get it to get a full screen? I'm missing something here. Do you? I can't. Oh, there it is, full screen mode. Oh, we're in business. That's great. Look, thank you. In advance, I always have to apologise. I've got too many slides, so they're mainly for me to kind of cue what I want to say, so forgive me if I rush through some of them. Just let me start with some remarks making connections with the other speakers. We didn't plan the sequence, but it's actually a very interesting logical sequence. We started off with what I think is a much more self-congratulatory picture from David than I'm going to give, and with Priya it was rather less so, but Priya was still talking about us, and I really want to shift the focus to them. That's the rest of the world. In that connection, while I want to make a reference here, one of the interesting remarks I just noted to myself while David was talking was the celebration of our system, our liberal democracy, and the rule of law, which is certainly correct. But of course, when we're thinking about us as opposed to them, there are a lot of others, for example, our colonial and imperial victims, who are not subject to the rule of law in quite the same way as we are. So I have a rather different theme, which is rather less rosy. And a couple of things in that vein that I'd like to talk about. So I'll just start going through my slides. Of course, predictably, I also use the same quote that one can't resist in a context like this from Mahatma Gandhi. But David's talk wasn't in the spirit of Mahatma Gandhi's remark in his joke, whereas I think mine is rather more so. I mean, he says, of course, it'd be nice to have a Western civilization. And my way of putting it is by way of answering the question that we're posed today, is the Western civilization doomed? My answer is, I hope so. And the reasons will become evident as we go along. One other remark, just before as I'm getting into my slides to warm up, so to speak, both previous speakers referred to the founding of democracy and referred to the Magna Carta and how we all started off recently. I have rather longer perspective I'd like to draw. I think it's not very controversial that democracy, anyway, as we understand it, started in ancient Greece, and there are some important lessons to be learned from what happened in ancient Greece, which I'm going to try to draw attention to. But to put it in the context that I want to talk about, here's a quote from Peter Gay, who wrote a book on the Enlightenment, and my view of what I understand civilization to be is essentially the Enlightenment project, as they call it, the principles of the Enlightenment, which have to do with rationality, objectivity, in particular a kind of skepticism, if not a harsher view of religion. But here's a quote which captures an important contrast between Enlightenment and barbarism. And David put up examples of recent barbarism in our history, which we're all very familiar with. I want to reflect on a rather different attitude to barbarism. This remark is, I'll just read it, in general, barbarism and religion has dominated the past, but a few glorious ages testify to the possibility that reason might not merely be the critic, but the master of civilization. This is the hope that reason will dominate and that rationality and scientific objectivity will dominate our way of thinking. Now, in fact, Priya mentioned, rather rudely, what was the term used? Frothing atheists. I'm going to talk about some of the atheists, which I think are the frothing ones. I confess to being an atheist, but I'm not in their company for various reasons I'll try to indicate. But the reason I mention them, and the connection with Priya's talk is interesting, it's been the atheists recently, in fact, celebrating their scepticism in Canberra, in Melbourne, I think it was, a big conference, and they lost their poster boy, Hitchens, recently. And I'm going to talk about those guys who I think are, in a sense, to sum up ahead of time, as it were, if I don't get the message out, that they celebrate rationality and scientific objectivity in their own good sense and their own reason. And they are the worst culprits in what I think is betraying the Enlightenment and what I think are the principles of democracy which go back to ancient Greece. So that's the kind of message that I want to get across, if I can get there. And so the heading is Champions of Reason. In the present intellectual environment, these are, by the way, quotes from things I've written recently, and I'm going to rely on some of my own work, and I'll do a plug for something I've written recently. In the present intellectual environment, my concern is the extent to which the champions of reason are indeed, in practice, on the side of civilization, and I think they're not. That's my point. The topic of barbarism, for example, the kind of barbarities which David rightly pointed to, with the classic examples always Hitler and Stalin, I think we should look closer to home. This question of barbarism, and particularly religious fanaticism among these frothing atheists, has become an obsessive burgeoning concern of scholarly and media commentators. Of course, it has a particular focus. Now, this is just a plug for an article where I've written this up rather more articulately and in more detail. I'm able to here, so I'll just put it up there as a way of just reminding myself of what to say. It appeared in an article recently in Overland called Silence Resembling Stupidity, which I'll explain, but it was a short version of a longer article called Gods of the State, Atheism, Enlightenment and Barbarity. And I'm going to try to give some flavour of the ideas in that paper. The Gods of the State, of course, is a reference to the charge for which Socrates was put to death. The great founding father, because of democracy, was the state of Athens. And the great home and founding country or founding state put the great philosopher to death. That's an interesting story which is relevant to understanding some of the problems I'm interested in. Well, let's look at the contemporary stuff. The great hero of these new atheists, one of these guys in the Four Horsemen, I think they're online, celebrating one another's brilliance. Sam Harris has written what I think is the most shocking book of all, that they all congratulate him for and praise him for his courage. It's called, I've just blocked on the title of it, some of you may know it, something about faith, The End of Faith, no, not The End of Faith, something like that. The thing that's wrong with it is that, I'm an atheist too, but they use atheism as a stick to beat up Islam and Muslims. They hate all religions, and they make no secret of that, but this is really part of what is, I think, a plague that is infecting us today, and which Edward Said had written about very eloquently as long ago as 1981, where the public demonisation of Muslims and Islam has reached, already by then, quite scary levels, and it's only got worse since then. That's a very important issue, and these atheists are guilty in the most... The book is called The End of Faith, I think, and that book in particularly is almost written according to the script, as it were, that Edward Said set out about how we're descending into this horrible racist period. Now, he says, anyone who cares about the fate of civilization, is what we're supposed to be talking about, would do well to recognise that the combination of great power and great stupidity is simply terrifying. He's talking about Muslims and Islam and what he calls the medieval mindset and well, I'll give you some choice quotes from their view, and you see already the kind of contrast I want to make. We think we're the civilised ones. Well, I think there's another side to this. So atheists today, such as Dawkins and Dennett, are full of admiration for such arrogant and sanctimonious rhetoric, suggesting that ignorance and religious credulity, quote, should be considered a moral and intellectual emergency. They're talking about the intellectual credulity, well, of religious believers generally, but particularly Muslims. And I'm going to ask the question about who's really guilty of the kind of blindness and the kind of lack of rational thought that they accuse others of. These popular highbrow skeptics pick an easy, perhaps even irrelevant target, meaning religion, since the danger to the world surely arises, as I'd suggest, from the sophisticated, secular and educated intellectuals like themselves. That's the point I want to make. The reason I say that they pick an easy target is because, well, look, I've got a kind of a slogan for this. I mean, which is worse? Believing things on inadequate evidence, I mean, I think religion doesn't have good evidence. Which is worse? Believing something on poor evidence, or believing something contrary to overwhelming evidence? And I think that these guys, when they try to paint a picture of the world and who's to blame for the barbarity, they're ignoring what is not even controversial. I'm going to give you a few hints, which we all know. I'm going to remind you of things that we all know, that these great intellectuals and scientific rationalists, who are champions of objectivity and reason, managed to not notice in their writings. Well, now here's a quote from Orwell, which is wonderful. Orwell said the best things about this. He said, this was in a suppressed preface to Animal Farm. Everybody knows or has read Animal Farm, but for many years this preface was unavailable And you'll see from the quote why. He says, the servility with which the greater part of the British intelligentsia have swallowed and repeated Russian, read American for the modern version of this, propaganda would be quite astounding if it were not that they have behaved similarly on several earlier occasions. On one controversial issue after another, the Russian viewpoint has been accepted without examination and then publicised with complete disregard to historical truth or intellectual decency. He was writing about the British intellectuals, and you can see why I think this is relevant today. He just replaced British with American. And he has a lovely remark. He says, one has to belong to the intelligentsia to believe such things. No ordinary man could be such a fool. David already mentioned my interest in Chomsky. My student's life, I can't go for half an hour without mentioning his name. During the Vietnam War, he wrote as follows. He wrote of the intellectuals who can be counted on in significant measure to provide the ideological justification for such barbarism as the US assault on the rural populations of Cambodia, Laos and Vietnam. And again later, of course, throughout Latin America and East Timor. These are the others that, when we celebrate our great virtue as a civilization, we conveniently neglect. And of course, Chomsky's been, since the Vietnam period in the 60s, been tirelessly trying to draw our attention to these issues. And that's why, of course, my ironic response to the question whether Western civilization is it's Western civilization that we celebrate that's responsible for these atrocities around the world. That's us. He wrote of the, quote, natural tendency of significant segments of the American intellectual community to offer their allegiance not to truth and justice, except, David rightly points out, when it's ourselves that are concerned, but to power and the effective exercise of power. And he says it's frightening to observe the comparative indifference of American, Australian, other intellectuals to the immediate actions of their government and its long-range policies and their frequent willingness, often eagerness, to play a role in implementing these policies. I have some pictures as well as text, but let me just go through this. Now, this is where we get to the ideas of these intellectuals that I'm picking on in particular, these great heroes and champions of scientific rationality and the Enlightenment. These writers congratulate themselves and each other. They sit around, as you saw in that video, perhaps, for their courage in speaking out in the face of what they describe as the primitive stupidities and cruelties of religion, as if there's some penalty in this society of beating up on Muslims. I mean, this is not really requiring any courage to in this society, as evidenced by the fact that they get these royalties and become famous for doing so. It's not exactly a dangerous occupation to be rude to Islam. As I say, the celebrity and royalties are undoubtedly evidence of their fearless sacrifice for the Enlightenment. Of course, the primitive stupidities of their own patriotic faith, which is the theme that I want to focus on, patriotic faith, and the cruelties of their own secular state are unnoticed, meaning, by any objective standard, most of the horrors in the world and those for which they share responsibility. And this is a quantitative statement. I say most of the horrors in the world. We can argue about this later on, perhaps in question time, and we can do an inventory of some of the contemporary horrors and see whether it's Muslims and their religious fanaticism that's to blame, or whether it's us either frothing or other sorts of atheists and agnostics, whether those in Canberra and Washington, who are the agnostics at least, are to blame for the barbarism of the world. And so, adopting a pose of secular humanists, atheists and agnostics, Hitchens and others, take Islam as primary evidence for the thesis that, quote, religion kills. With the catastrophic US invasion underway, Hitchens, this is in Iraq, I've taken these notes from the longer article, he writes in all seriousness, open the newspaper or turn on the television and see what the parties of God are doing to Iraq. Now, you have to be kind of suffering a kind of clinical derangement not to have noticed who's caused most of the deaths in Iraq. Mind you, they're not published very often in the newspapers, I'll get to that. It hardly requires systematic media analysis to judge, even from newspapers, that the immense death toll in Iraq, in 1991 to start with, and then the second time, in 2003, might be attributable to overwhelming US military power and not just religious fanatics. Writing at a moment when published estimates of the death toll exceed 1 million, that's the second time around, and refugees number up to 4 million, Hitchens' book is astonishing for failing to mention these facts, even to challenge them. It's not that he's denying them, he just conveniently doesn't happen to refer to them because they tell a different story. And, of course, the contrast would be, imagine an analogous summary of Vietnamese history during the war in the 60s. for the decades of the 1960s and 70s that cited the activism of Buddhist monks but entirely overlooked the US invasion and its 2 million victims or more. That's the kind of contrast I think one should make here. Likewise, it's delusory to suggest that the cause of, as they do, the Israel-Palestine conflict is, quote, the exclusive claims to God-given authority made by hysterical clerics on both sides. It's one of my current particular interests, and I'm happy to talk about it later on, but that's, I mean, a high school kid would know that that's an entirely inappropriate analysis of the Israel-Palestine conflict. There are, of course, the crazies who think God gave them the land, but you know what goes on in Washington, what goes on in Tel Aviv, what goes on in, you know, there's another story about that. It's nothing about religion. In fact, I can't think of a single, perhaps historians among us could correct me on this, I can't think of a contemporary conflict going back, let's say, for quite a period, that is actually caused by religion. Religion is there as an element, but I think if you analyse seriously in any plausible way the major conflicts in the world, religion isn't at the heart of any of them. So what are these guys talking about? And of course, they blame people like Osama bin Laden explicitly with what they describe as purely theological grievances. Like he's some crazy guy in a cave who just had theological grievances against us. It's only if readers can overlook our own, they call the cult of death, that they can accept Harris's suggestion that bin Laden and other Muslims have absurd, purely theological grievances against us, and that, quote, it's rare to find the behaviour of human beings so fully and satisfactorily explained in terms of Muslim irrationality and heroic acts of credulity. I think they're guilty of heroic acts of credulity in ways that are very interesting. If you look at what bin Laden actually said, as they recommend, you know, Hitchens, one of them, says, oh, we should just take them seriously. Well, that we should. I think he recommended we should read a book called Rogue State by an American, William Bloom, historian. That's the list of 20 or 30, I don't know how many countries America has bombed since the Second World War. And that doesn't include the countries whose regimes, whose dictatorships we installed, and whose military, like in Latin America, we armed. I mean, this is a small fraction of the horrors in the world that just the US has been responsible for. I mean, you know, they didn't invade Iran when they installed the Shah and funded his torturing and so on. So there's a long list of horrors which somehow these great intellectuals and scientific rationalists have managed not to notice. Here's another example. The lesson to be learned from over 250,000 Iraqi civilians casualties, according to the White House spokesman Marlon Fitzwater, was that it's the Iraqis who don't value the sanctity of life, as the Americans do. That was a quote. By the way, I don't know if you know, former US Attorney General Ramsey Clark, he was Attorney General under President Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson. He wrote several books, ran a war crimes tribunal. He had been at Nuremberg in 1945 at the war crimes trial of the Germans. And he ran a tribunal in 1992 and put on a trial and had pages of testimony condemning and finding guilty of 19 counts of crimes against humanity and war crimes and Geneva Convention violations of George Bush Sr., Colin Powell, Dick Cheney, a whole bunch of the leading guys, crimes for which we hanged a lot of Germans. I don't know if you know the number, his number, of civilians, in fact the total number of Iraqis that were killed the first time in 91, not now, not the recent about. In question time, some of you can perhaps tell me if you knew this. The figure he gives is over 300,000, of whom 120,000 were civilians. We're talking about major civilian atrocities, war crimes by any standard. And these are somehow not on the horizon for these guys that are describing the causes of terror and horror in the world. The AWB, the wheat board scandals, in the entire Australian coverage of the terrible scandal of the kickbacks to the Aliyah truck company in Iraq and Saddam, there was not one mention of what had been in the newspapers, very significantly, which was the fact that Dennis Halliday and Hans von Sponeck, who were the UN humanitarian coordinators of the Oil for Food program, the humanitarian program, they resigned in protest against the sanctions which Halliday described as genocidal. We're in the process of destroying an entire society. It's as simple as terrifying as that. It's illegal and immoral. When asked about what were estimated to be 500,000 deaths of children caused by the sanctions, which the newspapers managed not to mention in all of the discussion of the Iraqi food scandal, the AWB. Secretary Madeleine Albright was asked what she thought about it. She said, we think the price is worth it. Again, of course, the price to the Iraqis. The war, I've got the figures here about the cost. Let me just skip ahead because, oh, no, I can't resist mentioned in that last part there, to give you a flavour of the mindset of these people. It's estimated to have cost an additional million Iraqi lives around the time that Harris was writing, but this is his conclusion, that it's the Muslims who are, quote, this is his words, standing eye deep in the red barbarity of the 14th century. Because there, he says, very intuitions about what constitutes cruelty lags behind our own. We are the ones that have a deep sense of morality, and we're on a different plane, he says, moral. The bombardment of Iraq had deliberately targeted water treatment plants, sewage treatment plants, electrical generating plants, communication centres, oil refineries, all violations of international law and the direct cause of vast numbers of children dying and so on. These are all war crimes. And he talks about the stage of development. I won't keep quoting it. He thinks George Bush is a representative, senior of our moral wealth. I mean, what can you say? It's time for us to admit that not all cultures are at the same stage of moral development. This is kind of delusional stuff. I mean, it's dangerous, scary stuff. So, the Age of Enlightenment, I won't go back into history, but it was also an age of terror, and the idea of enlightenment somehow being central to our own civilization it has to be qualified. So I'll jump across some of these slides. Forgive me for jumping too far. I've got a lot of other things, perhaps if I've got time to still get through. Let me just skip through these. There was a slide there that mentioned the religion of patriotism. They're against religion, all right, but they don't notice that their own patriotic faith, their kind of belief in their own state, is a secular religion. It's a kind of faith which is equally unfounded and equally passionate and equally irrational, and in fact much more deeply rooted in certain ways, which I hope I have a moment to show you the psychology of that. So I'm going to just skip through a lot of this stuff that I'd say more carefully. Religion poisons everything, and so on. I'll just jump through a lot of these slides, if you forgive me doing this. It'll take the rest of the evening just to go through them. Chomsky says, of course, that a fact that must colour any discussion of contemporary institutions, our own, not just American, is that the level of culture, the level of our civilization, to use our theme, that can be achieved in the United States is a life and death matter for large masses of suffering humanity. So the question is to achieve the ideals that were not just in the Magna Carta, but in ancient Greece, that are truly fine and noble ideals, if only we could realise them without this kind of hypocrisy and humbug. Again, I've got a bunch of quotes that put this in nice context, but I can't resist reading this one from Albert Speer, who was, as you know, Hitler's architect. He says, not to have tried to see through the whole apparatus of mystification was already criminal. For being in a position to know, and nevertheless shunning knowledge, creates direct responsibility for the consequences at the very beginning. It's a remarkable statement from Albert Speer after he saw it all, and he was taking responsibility for not having seen or protested early. Clearly, I'm suggesting that we ought to learn this lesson. Bertrand Russell, one of my heroes, said that the good people, ironically, is one whose opinions are pleasing to the holders of power. That's how you stay in the good books. It's true at my institution at the university. It's true more broadly speaking. And I won't quote it, and I won't read through it carefully, but Russell was reviled and vilified for his views because he was a seriously committed intellectual, but also committed to truth and justice and all of the noble principles. They hated him for it. He was a dissident intellectual. He was one who stood up in the ways in which we should. And that's the model that I think we should all adopt. And I show my students always a list of my heroes. You may not agree with all of them, but and Galileo is one that I mentioned. Socrates, of course, and Russell and Chomsky, I think, are important examples of the kind of heroism. I won't keep reading the quotes, but I've got a couple that I do want to read. He says, traditionally, the role of the intellectual, or at least his self-image, has been that of dispassionate critic. That's how intellectuals like to think of themselves. But insofar as that role has been lost, which it has, he says the relation of schools, universities and schools, to intellectuals should be one of self-defence. You should be taught how to defend yourself and to think critically against the education and the intellectuals, because they're the ones that are brainwashing. Children have to be spared indoctrination, but they have to be trained to resist it in later life. In other words, the purpose of an education, he says, is to be subversive. And the first step is to penetrate the clouds of deceit and distortion to learn the truth about the world. Again, I'll jump through it, but schools, he says, are institutions for indoctrination, and we have to learn how to think independently of the rewards that we get if we want to uphold the Enlightenment values. So, just summing this slide up, Social and intellectual role of the university should be subversive. You should teach kids to think. Russell has a lovely way of putting it. He says children should be taught to think, not to think what their teachers think. And that's a nice way to make the point. Let me jump right further through all this stuff. Of course, here are the pre-Socratics and the early Greeks to whom we owe our ideals, and Socrates, who paid the price for being a critical thinker. And of course, Socrates got the hemlock for challenging the so-called experts, the so-called intellectuals, who he showed really didn't know as much as they thought they knew, and he paid the price for it. Now, that's the model, I think, and that's where the phrase gods of the state comes from. The term now is used metaphorically to refer to, in that case, it was the actual religious beliefs that he was accused of not sharing and being an atheist. But it's used now in terms, in the sense I'm using it, to refer to our belief in the state and the sacred cows of the state. So let me try and wind up. There are examples which I'd like to give, and I haven't got time. I was going to give you some psychology of groupthink. Let me end perhaps on this if I can still take a few minutes. One of the features of not thinking for yourself, if I had time I'd go through this example, a psychology example, but I won't do it. It has to do with how difficult we find it to be critical, to exercise that kind of scepticism, and to think of the contrary to what we're encouraged and taught to believe. There's a book about the consequences of this when we are in groups. It's even worse. You know, companies now, corporations send their teams off to all this kind of solidarity training and teach you how to be a group that's all unified. It's the worst thing you can do for people. A group that acts in solidarity precludes people thinking independently and speaking out, and the dissidence is discouraged. And the examples of that are very interesting. Let me quickly run through this. What we are taught at school is to be a team player, and it's thought to be a virtue, and I think it's part of the problem. And in fact, sports are generally used to divert us, but in any case, they train us in certain reflexes of belonging, and that has very serious consequences. This is the consequence of, taking football seriously. That's what you learn. Well, this is not the only lesson, and I've got some other things to say. I gave a version of this talk to a Jewish audience. I have to say at this point I'm Jewish, and so I provoke them into thinking a little bit about why they share their particular views and support, in this case, the state of Israel and its crimes. And I asked, when you belong to a group, what do you have in common with all these people? And the answer is nothing. And you shouldn't feel that should override your capacity to be critical, which is the case in point. And there's a story about, I won't go into it, of a police battalion where they committed an atrocity, and the main reason was they didn't want to step out of line. They were given the option, but they didn't. This is a famous story, infamous story. They just didn't want to be seen to step out of line and break ranks with their fellows. And they committed atrocities which made them ill afterwards, basically machine gunning women and children. Now that's the sort of story. Why do soldiers learn to march in line? You don't go into battle like that anymore. I mean, you don't even go into battle. You stay in some room and press computer buttons and kill people remotely. Why do they do this? This is to create that kind of solidarity. Why do you do this stupid stuff? There are reasons for it. Group behaviour, they actually tried this. If you march around with a group of people, they've done these experiments in psychology. You march around the campus with a bunch of students in step, singing some song they don't even know. In America, you get them to sing the Canadian national anthem. And you come into the lab then and you play cooperative games. The people that have done that, they behave very differently to one another compared to the other people. They show a kind of allegiance to a group. If you flip a coin, I take the two sides of this room and I play certain cooperative games with each other. It's completely arbitrary. I'm assuming you didn't sit because you know each other. People will behave differently in their own group than with the other group. They'll think if they do well, it's because they were lucky. If you do well, it's because you're smart. They'll have these kind of rationalisations for your own group's behaviour. These are very deep psychological feelings that we need to learn to avoid. It's herding behaviour. I'll tell you this example. This is a scary example. You give a subject these lines and you ask which of the three on the right are the same length, which one is the same length as the one over there. But you rig it. You have 9 other subjects who are actually stooges, confederates of the experimenter. And they will all say the wrong one. They'll say, I don't know, the shortest one, which is not. Your real subject is last. A huge number of people, when they've heard all the other answers, they actually say the same as the others. They change their opinion. They don't do it knowingly. The scary thing about this is they don't do it deliberately to conform. They see it differently. Something about the group has made them think and behave differently. And thank you.